Thank you very much for joining us this evening at our Declassified Live. As ever, if you have any questions for our contributors, do not hesitate to drop your comment underneath wherever you're watching it and we'll get to your questions. In an exclusive back in February, we revealed that more than 2,000 Britons served in the Israeli Defense Forces during the Gaza genocide. In the interests of transparency, public safety, and justice, Declassified and the ICJP have launched a major campaign to demand that the UK government do three things: that they track the movements of Brits who have served in the IDF, subject them to secondary screening where necessary at ports of entry, support robust war crimes investigations in line with domestic and international law. Our campaign is called Nobody Wants to Live Next to a War Criminal, and you can sign the open letter that we have put together. Over, I think, 13,000 people now have signed that open letter. And tonight we are going to be joined by John McAvoy, who broke that story and who is leading on that campaign. He's our chief reporter. We're also going to be joined by Mark Curtis, our co-director, Dania Akkad, our deputy editor, and Dr. Paul O'Connell, reader in law at SOAS, and he'll talk to us about the broader attack on civil liberties, which of course has been intense over the last 2 years, but has a longer history than that. As always, I'll probably say this 2 or 3 times tonight, your donations help fund our investigations. So if you can become a monthly supporter, that would be very, very much appreciated. I'm going to come straight over to John now. John has been working for many, many months, if not years, looking at the influence of Israel on our political system. But this campaign, John, came from one of your revelations, and it's about demanding that the government uphold the very basics of domestic and international law, because we've seen with our own eyes over the last 2.5 years the intense brutality and repeated war crimes that have taken place in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. But I want you to now take us through how you got to this point, talking first about the revelation that more than 2,000 Britons served in the IDF during the Gaza genocide.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Laura. We've been looking into this issue pretty much since the start of the genocide back in October 2023. And what we found was it's virtually impossible to get any information whatsoever on how many Britons, British Israeli dual nationals, had joined the IDF and had gone over to Israel to participate in the genocide and, potentially commit war crimes and crimes against humanity themselves. Every time we went to the Ministry of Defence or the Foreign Office or the Home Office asking for data on this very issue, they would come back and basically say, well, we don't collect data on this issue. We have no idea. So you could ask a parliamentary question, you could put in a freedom of information request, but that was totally useless because the government had no idea how many of its citizens were fighting in an army that was committing genocide, and therefore had no idea how many were returning from engaging in genocide and potentially living amongst us. In fact, the information came from a lawyer in Israel who submitted a freedom of information request to the IDF, and the information came via that. And obviously we learned that over 2,000 Britons had been serving in the IDF amid the genocide. I mean, it wasn't just Britons. We found out the number of people from the US, France, Russia, Germany, Ukraine. Britain was their sixth. And it was quite astonishing, really. And it wasn't just us who found this astonishing. I mean, this report was covered all across Europe, covered in Australia, covered in South Africa, across Asia as well, because I think people across the world were shocked to learn that, people who were living amongst them had gone over to Israel to engage in what many people will see as one of the worst crimes in their lifetime. So that was what led up to the initial article, basically.
Okay, and so you've taken some of the findings of that, and it is an important point that you raise about this actually not just pertaining to Britain. This could be emulated, this kind of call, and has probably been emulated. That there are three steps that really the government could take. I mean, it's quite astonishing. We can go through them again if people want. But it's quite astonishing that these steps haven't already been taken. So let's just remind people. So it's to track the movement of Brits who have served in the IDF, to subject them to secondary screening when necessary at port of entry, and to support robust war crimes investigations in line with domestic and international law. So what is preventing, like, why isn't the government already doing this?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a total lack of political will, right? Because obviously the first demand in that in our campaign is that they actually collect data on this issue. Because obviously, if they have no idea who has been over in Gaza committing potential war crimes, then how on earth are they supposed to uphold their international and domestic obligations, legal obligations to prevent and punish genocide, and to hold individuals accountable for potential involvement in war crimes and crimes against humanity? I mean, if they have no data, they literally cannot do that. And that's why the very first demand is as it is. And the other demands focus on obviously upholding international law, but it's also an issue of public safety, right? If someone has gone over to engage in a genocide against Palestinians, comes back to the UK, potentially they work in public institutions, hospitals, the police, schools, then, who's to say that it's safe for, say, a Palestinian child to be taught by someone who's recently returned from engaging in a genocide against their family? I think that's quite a horrific thought for Palestinians in the UK to have. So it's also an issue, a basic issue of public safety. And a lot of people in the UK agree. I mean, we've almost got 14,000 signatures on this campaign, and it's been around a week that it's been out. So yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of public support for this. I can't hear you. Sorry, Laura.
There is absolutely loads of support for this, and it seems like it's captured people's attention because whilst we haven't moved on from what we saw in Gaza over the last 2.5 years, and of course the kind of so-called ceasefire that is currently in place, much of the mainstream media, and for all it was entirely problematic, and we've covered that as well, much of the mainstream media has moved on from talking about this issue at all. And there are so many issues of accountability for our government, but also for those people who could have potentially been complicit in war crimes. And it does seem, and maybe you could talk to us a little bit about this, John, but it does seem that the juxtaposition between impunity for those people who have potentially committed war crimes while serving for the IDF in Gaza, and then those people who are standing up against a genocide, it seems like a really stark contrast, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really jarring. Obviously, we haven't seen one prosecution of any British Israeli who's gone over to join the genocide. We haven't even seen a meaningful investigation on the part of the Metropolitan Police's War Crimes Unit. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that if you go on the travel advice for Ukraine, I mean, there's a specific kind of warning to Britons that if they go over, they might be liable to prosecution upon return. I mean, that doesn't exist for Israel whatsoever. So that's just returning to that issue of whether there's political will to actually pursue these kinds of investigations and prosecutions. And to us, it certainly seems like that doesn't exist whatsoever. And I mean, of course, the reason for that is because Israel is a key geopolitical ally of Britain, and that's where the lack of political will flows. And that's also relevant to when you see the full weight of the British state bearing down upon activists in the UK who have sought to try to stop the genocide, intervene in the genocide. So we've had obviously the description of Palestine Action, which was the first time in British history that a civil disobedience organisation was prescribed under terrorism legislation. But it's worth noting as well that next Friday, there will be a sentencing hearing for the first Filton activist. Now, this is a group of Palestine Action activists who back in August 2024 raided an Israeli weapons factory belonging to Elbit Systems. Now, they're going to be sentenced on Friday with a potential terrorism connection to their case. And that will be the first case that we've seen in recent British history of activists being sentenced with this legislation. And what it will mean for them, if the judge decides to apply it to the case, is that their sentences will be aggravated, meaning they'll have to spend much longer in prison than people charged with the same crimes. They could be treated as terrorists for decades after even being released. All of their relationships will have to be logged with the police. Their devices will have to be logged with the police, and any slip up on their part or any accidental slip up might mean them returning to prison for a minimum of 5 years. So these are really, really punitive measures to be taken against activists. And if you conflate that against, the treatment of potential Israeli-British dual nationals who've committed war crimes, you can really see where the priorities of the British state lie.
Yeah, so there hasn't been, as far as we know, any meaningful investigations into people who could potentially be complicit in war crimes in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, the Metropolitan Police announced about 2 weeks ago that they'd closed their scoping exercise. I mean, it didn't even reach the point of a meaningful investigation. They basically said, we're closing our scoping exercise after a private application was put in by some human rights organisations. They said there's insufficient evidence to even progress the investigation to progress to a meaningful investigation. And it's worth noting as well that it took a private application to the Metropolitan Police. They didn't pursue this on their own accord. They were effectively forced into it. And once again, for the simple reason that how are they supposed to investigate something that they have no data on, and simultaneously the Foreign Office is telling the public time and time again that it has no evidence of Israel intentionally committing war crimes.
Absolutely unbelievable. John, we've got people watching. You have been leading on this campaign. You want people to sign the letter. You will be handing it in to the government. So this is kind of your not last pitch, because we'll be talking about this as an organisation definitely for the next few weeks. But why should people sign, in a nutshell? And we've got the little QR code up on the screen now for anyone that does want to go and sign that petition straight away. But yeah, why should people sign?
In a nutshell, because if we allow genocide to be committed with total impunity, then we've lost our whole moral basis of society, I'd say.
Yeah, and I very much agree. And currently, as you said, almost 14,000 other people very much agree. John, thank you so much for leading on this campaign and all of the work that you have done for Declassified in the initial revelation about the kind of scale of the number of people who fought for the IDF. And please do sign the petition. If you are watching this and you haven't done so already, please do also let other people know about this campaign. Nobody wants to live next to a war criminal. With those 3 really reasonable requests of the government, we're going to come at Mark now. Mark Curtis is a co-director for Declassified, and he has done so much reporting on the relationship between Israel and the UK and the influence of the Israel lobby on our political system. And Mark, you've been writing for such a long time about this, and of course that writing intensified over the last 2.5 years, and we know why. But could you set some context for anybody who is watching about what our relationship to Israel is currently?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Laura, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I mean, we're talking about impunity here, That's really the whole point of the campaign, is to end that impunity for these Britons that have gone off to fight for Israel. And it seems to me that this is a kind of a leitmotif of the problem that we face in holding governments to account, and has been for a very long time. And on that theme, I wanted to talk about two unmentionable things in the mainstream media that strike me as being absolutely critical, that we need to draw attention to. One is, I want to talk about John Healey. He's been the Defence Secretary since Keir Starmer came into power in July 2024, who has been involved in numerous policies that amount to complicity in that Israeli genocide. And he's going around the country as though nothing has happened. He's at large, he's being interviewed by the media, he's turning up in Westminster as though nothing whatsoever has happened. And yet, look at what he's been doing over the last few years as Defence Secretary, promoting, authorising British military policies. And these are some of the revelations that we've done over the last few years. I mean, there's been the issue of Israeli training by British military officials in the UK during the genocide. At least half a dozen Israelis have been trained here since October 2023, and we've revealed some stories around that. At the same time, British military officials have been training in Israel during the genocide. And in response to a Freedom of Information request that we issued, the MOD admitted that a few soldiers had trained at the RCDS, the Royal College of Defence Studies, in 2023 and 2024. One of them, a guy called Yefka Norkin, completed that course in 2024 and went on to be one of the Israeli commanders in its invasion of Lebanon. So Healey is front and center involved in this, in terms of Israeli military operations. The second thing is that all these high-level visits that have been taking place. I mean, it seems to me that we are virtually the only organization, and one or two others maybe, who have really been reporting on this. The high-level visits between Britain and Israel over the last few years. And this is visits to Israel by British military officials, and it's visits the other way by Israeli military officials to the UK during a genocide. And John McAvoy, who's just spoke, has revealed more about this than anyone. We've seen over the last couple of years visits by the IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, and the Commander of the Air Force, Tomar Bar, to the UK, which is bad enough. But the government has gone even further in facilitating their visits by issuing them with these special immunity certificates to make sure they're not prosecuted during their visits. So they've really gone out of their way to facilitate these visits. And in terms of trips the other way, I mean, we revealed last year that British officials have undertaken 49 trips to Israel during in the first 2 years of the genocide. And what are these trips all about? I mean, there's complete secrecy behind them. The government's completely untransparent about it. We don't know what's happening in these conversations, but from what we've seen and from what we can gather, they amount to ongoing British military support for Israel during a genocide. People who have been reading Declassified and watching Declassified over the last few years will know about the spy flights that Britain's been conducting from Cyprus, hundreds of them throughout the genocide, claiming these are just about helping Israel identify hostages, but nevertheless providing aid to Israeli intelligence for over 2 years, hundreds of spy flights, again, very untransparent. The government has refused to release footage from those spy flights that could aid prosecutors holding Israel to account for possible war crimes in Gaza. The government has point blank not released any of that footage. And I come back to John Healey. He is the person that's been authorizing this and is subject to total impunity by the media and by the political system. And it strikes me that's one of the things which is unmentionable in the mainstream to hold this person to account for basic complicity in crimes. The other thing I wanted to mention that strikes me as being also taboo is Britain's policy towards the West Bank, because the West Bank has become a very serious crisis point over the last year in particular. I mean, after decades of it being a crisis point as well. But over the last year, over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed, often by Israeli settlers. There are now 750,000 illegal Israeli settlers in the occupied territory of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And it's a horrendous situation. And Britain issues these statements saying that we condemn the violence and we condemn the illegal settlements. But what does it do? What does it actually do to hold Israel to account for those policies? I mean, pretty much nothing as far as we can tell, right? And the reason for that is this unmentionable, which is that I think that Britain supports Israel's ongoing colonization of Palestine. I mean, that is the British policy. They support Israel's gradual takeover of Palestine. They don't say that. They can't say that. They want to be seen to be upholding international law. So they say that the settlements are illegal and so on, but they don't actually do anything about it. So the de facto policy is to support Israel's ongoing illegal occupation of Palestine. The simplest thing that the UK government could do, if it was really keen to press Israel, the very simplest thing would be to ban trade with those illegal settlements. That's a really simple step for a country imposing really sophisticated sanctions on loads of countries around the world, you know, really looking in detail at trade issues. This would be very simple. The government refuses to do it. There's 2 or 3 other European countries now that are pledging to ban the import of trade from those illegal settlements. Britain is refusing to do it. The other major thing here is that nearly 2 years ago now, it was in July 2024, the International Court of Justice issued a landmark finding, which is a non-binding finding, but in effect a ruling, saying that states must stop being complicit in the occupation of the illegally occupied territories, and calling on states to stop aiding and assisting that occupation. And that was nearly 2 years ago. The UK government has not even responded to the ICJ's call. And there's been a fair number of questions in Parliament about this, actually, with ministers asking the government, why have you not even responded to the ICJ ruling? And the government keeps saying, well, we haven't yet decided on our response. And again, this is duplicitous nonsense. They have decided their response. They support Israel in its ongoing occupation of Palestine. The reason they don't respond to it is they know that the policies are illegal, and they know that British in effect facilitation of those policies is also illegal, and they don't want to expose themselves to being called for being described as promoting illegal policies. Now, there's a whole load of other policies that Britain could promote to stop Israel if it really wanted to put pressure on it. I mean, one of the things that Declassified has been revealing over the last couple of years is the secret military agreement that the UK has with Israel. It was signed in 2020. The British have never publicized the agreement. It was publicized by the Israeli side. Britain's never publicized it. It's barely ever spoken about it. It's only spoken about it when it's had to, when it's been forced to by 1 or 2 MPs. That accord has never been published. The government refuses to publish it. They've given us a short sort of top line summary of what they claim is in it, but they're refusing to publish it. Why does the UK have a military agreement with a country that's been bombarding Gaza, bombarding Lebanon, bombarding Iran? I mean, it's absolutely unconscionable. And again, I come back to John Healey. I mean, he's the guy who's presiding over all this. So again, it comes back to impunity, and I think this is a key thing that we will be carrying on working on. And Laura, you asked John, in a nutshell, why should people sign this petition? And it is very much what John said. It is about, if we've totally lost our moral compass in this, and we are prepared we shouldn't be prepared to allow our ministers to get away with these levels of impunity for complicity in some of the worst crimes of our time. I'll leave it there if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, that was a tour de force, if you like, about the multiple layers of the relationship of the UK with Israel. It isn't a surprise then that we get to a point where we're having to pressure the government like we are through all of the different ways that different groups, organizations, individuals are. And the campaign that we've launched is it's so rational, it's so reasonable what we are asking. There's no outlandish claims in the letter that we've written, and everyone is free to go and read that letter. We're asking people to track the movements of people who have served in the Israeli Defense Forces, and we're asking them to subject those people to secondary screening where necessary, and to support robust war crime investigations. And even those very, very reasonable asks of the government, you can start to see are being kind of repositioned as somehow unreasonable or contributing to hostilities inside the UK. We're talking about people who have potentially committed war crimes here, and all we're asking for essentially is an investigation. But you can see that even those very, very reasonable asks, and we do urge everybody who is watching this to sign that letter, are positioned as somehow unreasonable. The world is literally turned upside down, isn't it, Mark, to support the most out. I mean, we've all seen it with our own eyes, but sometimes the reaction to even saying the word genocide or asking for investigations into potential war crimes, because in practice, the state is very proactively trying to implement the status quo when it comes to foreign policy. I don't know if you have anything more to say on that, Mark, but I really do urge people to sign this open letter. It's so important that we get as many signatures as possible. It's also really important that we do keep talking about how reasonable these demands are, these asks are of the government. While I'm at it, I just want to tell you about another thing that Mark mentioned in his powerful contribution, is that we have at Declassified been looking at and investigating the surveillance flights over Gaza for over 2.5 years now. And we have produced a groundbreaking documentary, and please do go and watch it. It's on YouTube. Britain's Gaza spy flight scandal. Alongside that, and we'll just pop it up onto the screen now, so you can go and watch that documentary at your leisure. But alongside that, we've produced a flyer which is asking the government to release the surveillance footage, and you'll see that there's a series of questions in that flyer. I just wanted to let everybody know that that flyer is publicly available. You can go and download that, you can use that, you can ask the questions that came out of that spy flights documentary, because there are many, many questions that are still unanswered by the government about what has happened with that surveillance footage. And of course, there are so many people that need answers to that question. So please do go and download that and use it to demand answers. We don't want our journalism to just stay on the page and just be information for information's sake. We do consider our journalism public service journalism. So we would really like whatever we find, the revelations, the exclusives, to then be used by people who are interested and who are moved by the journalism. We've talked a lot about in the first half of this show about our campaign, and it's quite right to do that, and a search to end the impunity for those who may have committed war crimes, and robust investigations into that. What we have also seen in the UK, and there is a long trajectory of this, but it has really kind of sped up in the last couple of years, is a clamping down on our civil liberties. And I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Paul O'Connell, who has been looking into this for some time, and you're very welcome, Paul. I think it would be good for our audience to first kind of have you set out what civil liberties actually are. It's kind of banded about, isn't it? There's an attack on our civil liberties. We are seeing a clamping down on our civil liberties. But what do we actually mean by that, Paul?
Yeah, it's a good question, and sort of not one that you can give a really short answer to, but I'll be as quick as I can. So there is debate and discussion around it in a sort of classic liberal sense. Civil liberties are about the freedom of the individual, and this sort of dovetails with some ideas around neoliberalism. It's the little bit of space that the individual has away from state interference. More expansively, civil liberties have been understood mostly as essential rights for people to participate in democratic governance and to engage in their societies. And the historian E.P. Thompson wrote eloquently about how in Britain in particular, civil liberties were won in the first instance by the mass organisation of the working class, the Chartists, the suffragettes and others. So civil liberties are, broadly speaking, they overlap with human rights and so forth, but it's that category of rights that we consider essential for people to have in a decent democratic society. So free speech, right to protest, fair trial, right to legal representation, things like that. Now, historically in Britain, we didn't have rights as such in the strict legal sense. We had things that we could do unless Parliament legislated to make them unlawful. And it's only with the Human Rights Act coming in 1998 and then coming into force in 2000 that we then had this consolidated in the way of rights in terms of the Human Rights Act.
Okay, so there is like a broad concept of what civil liberties are, and I'm sure there's different political theories around that
Competing
as well.
theories, yeah.
Competing theories, of course. I wonder concretely in what way civil liberties have been eroded and kind of over what period. I know that's really just take us back to the beginning of time, please.
Yeah.
But maybe not that long, but from the outset, of course, I imagine people had to and did fight for rights, and again, not concrete rights, but fight for things not to be outlawed. And then you see the state kind of clamping back on that. What has this looked like over the long term?
So I'd say in a modern sense, what's interesting, and again, you can go back. Obviously, in Britain, every year we mark the Peterloo massacre, and that was one instance of the working class expressing its collective right to organise, to gather, to speak on issues of importance, and we saw how the British state reacted. But by the late 19th into the early 20th century, there was more of a shift towards what's referred to sometimes as a safety valve approach, especially to the right to protest, where even elements of Britain's ruling class recognised the value of allowing protest, allowing free speech, because otherwise you might end up with clandestine organisations and revolution and so forth. And it's interestingly that in 1968, when James Callaghan was the Home Secretary, and there were anti-Vietnam War protests that went so far as to storm the US Embassy in London, and there's serious clashes and serious sort of interventions, and some sections of the media and of the political class were calling for more powers to clamp down on these protesters, and Callaghan refused to do so, stressing how important the right to protest was, especially as this sort of safety valve. But interestingly, I think, and sort of depressingly in a way, this year is the 40th anniversary of the Public Order Act of 1986. And I suppose we could start the story about the contemporary attack on civil rights just before the Public Order Act of 1986, in particular with the miners' strike. And then again, bringing the history into it. the British police were trained secretly, first of all, by the British military in tactics that they developed in the occupied counties on the north of Ireland in order to develop policing to deal with striking miners and other striking workers. And throughout the miners' strike, the police, using their powers to prevent a breach of the peace, engaged in a series of practices which fundamentally limited the right to protest, the right to go on strike, and the courts backed them up on this. And this was then consolidated in the Public Order Act of 1986. And what's interesting was at the time, when the Public Order Bill was going through Parliament, the Labour Party opposed it. Chris Smith, who was a Labour Party spokesperson, criticised the government, saying that they were prioritising the convenience of shoppers and businesses and traffic over the importance of the right to demonstrate. When the Public Order Act introduced vast and wide discretionary powers for the police to determine whether or not a protest, whether that's a march or a static demonstration, whether it might constitute or cause a breach of the peace or disturbance. And that's been expanded upon over the years, and especially in the last 5 years, it's been accelerated. But it's been a long-term process, and it's interesting because late last year into early this year, Netpal, who do fantastic work, and also Justice, who do good work, and Human Rights Watch, they published reports about the attack on the right to protest in Britain, and especially in the context of the protests against the genocide in Gaza, and also the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which again is not a sort of radical left group or anything of that sort, also registered really strong concerns about it. What's interesting is they all said we need to go to a pre-2002 situation, and they actually cited the white paper that led to the introduction of the Public Order Act in 86 as a great example of how to balance protest and policing. But actually, when you situate it in the longer historic context, the Act of 86 consolidated what was already happening with the miners, but then set in motion where we are now with a much more limited right to protest.
I mean, that's really interesting. And I think that what people might be wondering is concretely, what does that mean for your freedoms? So,
Yeah.
and we'll come on to the kind of rapid acceleration of some of the tightening of the state's grip, if you like, over the last 2.5 years. But even pre the genocide, what has it meant for how people are able to organize or fight back on any particular issue?
Yeah. So it
What
has
has
to
it
be
meant?
put a lot. Yeah, no, I think really important question. It has to be put alongside other things. I caught the tail end of what Mark was talking about there, about the really important campaign that Declassified has launched around trying to overcome the impunity for Britons who might have served in the Israeli forces and being party to all sorts of war crimes in Gaza. But that's a broader trend. So the previous British government introduced the Overseas Operations Act, as well as what we call the Covert Intelligence or the Spy Cops Act, which again provide impunity for British military personnel and British police, and also put it alongside the increasingly draconian legislation around trade unions and the capacity to go on strike. And I know the minimum service regulations have been rolled back a bit now, but still the right to strike is fundamentally circumscribed in the British context. So it's part of a much wider assault. The gist of it, the short version of it is that whether we like it or not, we're all Thatcher's children. And so when Thatcher declared that there was no alternative, what the law has done in lots of respects over the last 40 years is codify that. So that basically in the past, where protest or coming out against the government was seen as a safety valve, now the logic, I'd argue, is that, well, there is no alternative. So your protests aren't going to change anything. We're going to support Israel. We're going to support the genocide, irrespective of how many hundreds of thousands you put on the street. So now we're in a position where what you're doing is disrupting consumption, and what you're doing is disrupting the consumer lifestyle, and we're not going to accept that. So the constant message, and you see it, and it's an empirical question about how effective it is. And again, there's some work being done on this, but more needs to be done. But basically, the police in Britain have had sufficient power to limit protests since at least 1986, and I'd say before then. So all the new legislation that's brought in is in part sending a message to people that you shouldn't protest, right? And actually, Shabana Mahmood explicitly said it after the horrific attacks in Manchester last year, which again, cynically, British politicians tried to link to the anti-genocide protests in Gaza. She explicitly said, just because you have the right to protest doesn't mean you have to use it, right? So again, this is a reframing of what protest means, and not just protest, but speech. We see with the sort of tightening, clamping down on free speech online, but also this recent, just in the news in the last day or so, the two streamers from the US who've been banned from coming to the UK because of their stance on Gaza, and so many other things. You know, the informal ways in which, let's say, Gary Lineker, for example, one of the most successful broadcasters, whatever you think of him as a broadcaster, but lost his job basically because of taking a very basic principled position on the genocide in Gaza. So it's happening on multiple levels, and again, the whole point behind it is it's the idea of providing an educational message to people to say, don't try to oppose this. So climate breakdown is something that anybody with an ounce of sort of scientific knowledge understands is happening at an accelerating pace. The idea of protesting against it is now become completely abhorrent. You know, it's shut down on so many different levels because, again, no government is going to do anything that in any way inhibits the accumulation that drives capitalism, that produces the climate breakdown. So the response is, well, just stop interfering, stop protesting. Likewise for the genocide in Gaza, likewise for issues around structural racism when the Black Lives Matter protests were taking place. So that's all the context. The not just this or that government. You can say Keir Starmer is an especially horrendous person, and he definitely is, but you could say the same about Rishi Sunak or David Cameron, but it wouldn't matter who the person was because this has been a response by the British state and the British ruling class over the last 40 years. And the whole, and again, it's also a global trend, which is a sort of a separate discussion. And the point of it is that there's no point in protesting. And if you do protest, you're going to be punished for it because it's just disruptive and that therefore isn't acceptable. And that's just protest, but also free speech and other aspects.
Well, of course, because I suppose if you're going to try and organise anything, you have to try and encourage people to come, and you have to make your case and your arguments. And we've seen a real kind of clamping down, and it does have a chilling effect on what language can be used, what slogans can be used on demonstrations, and how then the mainstream legacy media and the state respond. Take us to the last 2.5 years then, Paul. So of course, we've seen repeated demonstrations out on the streets. I think sometimes every single week. I know that happened in local communities as well. We're seeing some footage now of some really robust, violent policing, you know, kind of really pushing back on those people who are taking part in that demonstration. And of course, people will always say there's kind of contextual justifications to that. But has there been a more aggressive approach by the state and then, of course, the police to carry that out in the last 2.5 years?
Yes. I'm drawing a blank on his name now, but the Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has bragged about it, has gone on record to say that we have shown zero tolerance to the Palestinian protests. But again, even before that, so Joanna Gilmore, who's an excellent scholar on protest and what goes on with protest, she wrote in the sort of early 2000s about how there was an authoritarian consensus around policing in Britain. And you go back to the early to mid 2000s with the anti-war protests, but also with the alter globalization protests, and how the police developed their tactics of kettling, you know, which again is an extremely aggressive and violent tactic, which has been upheld as consistent with the Human Rights Act by both the British Supreme Court and by the European Court of Human Rights. So they can still say you have a right to protest, but it's okay to kettle in that way. But we also see it again as a global trend, and America, of course, is the outlier with it, or the sort of leading example, but Britain's not too far behind, of the increasing militarization of the equipment that the police use and the way in which they approach protests. So again, it's that shift from the idea of protest as a presumptively legitimate form of democratic
Mm-hmm.
expression and a civil liberty to be protected and valued, to the presumption that protest is a threat, that it's disruptive by its nature, and that therefore it should be clamped down on. That's the big shift. And then, of course, I'd say the last 5 years especially, but also the last 2.5, coming up to 3 years now, since Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza began, that's accelerated. And again, it happens both through formal legislation, but also in the form of how the political class deals with these, how they delegitimize certain protests. So it started almost after the first anti-genocide protest, when Suella Braverman referred to it as hate marches, a phrase which again was recently used by Preeti Patel. So again, that language constantly being pushed out, the delegitimization of it. And again, I think Orwell's a mediocre writer and politically very suspect, but it is a sort of 1984 thing.
This will
where
get the comments going, Paul. Now you're gonna have people divided on that.
All the Orwell defenders will be in. But the thing is that like you're in a position now where a consensus amongst political classes and mainstream media that the people opposing a genocide are the bad guys, and the people supporting a genocide are the reasonable and put upon victims of racism or whatever it might be. It's a bizarre inversion of reality. And so, of course, again, the legislation that has accelerated in the last couple of years is the police crime police sentencing crime Act of 2002, which again mainly came in after the Black Lives Matter protests, and as a reaction to that, to try and limit them, and also the XR protests. The Public Order Act in 2023, which came in, and now we've got the excuse me, we've got the Police and Crime Act, which is before Parliament at the moment. And what's interesting about that is, again, I'll go back to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, who again are no radicals, are no sort of firebrands, but they have subjected each of these pieces of legislation to scrutiny while they were in draft form, and have been scathing in their criticism of it. And the most recent report on the Crime and Policing Bill, I'll just quote it because it's worth saying it, is that this report has to be understood as part of a broader context, as part of an ongoing and far-reaching legislative crackdown on the exercise of peaceful protest rights. Right, so that's not a sort of trade unionist or a protester in the street saying that. This is the Joint Committee on Human Rights, and you can add to that what UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, what the Council of Europe's leading commentator on human rights, what so many people have said, is that this right is under attack again in Britain. The interesting thing, though, and again, this is where the law plays a dual role. So on the one hand, there's the very real physical side of it, those people getting arrested for expressing their support for Palestine action after its prescription. Its prescription has been found to be unlawful, but it's still in effect while the case is under appeal. But again, a massive extension of the concept of terrorism to a non-violent direct action group. The first time it was directed at a group that only causes damage to property, and again, a group that's opposing a genocide. That has to be stressed again. So there is the physical side of it, but again, it's this educational side of this legislation, because the police have had more than enough powers. It's interesting, before the PCSCA came in, a large number of police forces said they didn't need any new powers in a report to the government, and it was only really the Metropolitan Police that were pushing for these new powers. But the government ministers, successive governments, that's Tory and Labour, are all enacting this new legislation to again send that message that protest is not acceptable. But it's not just protest. Again, it's also digital IDs, the attack on jury trials, all of this wider assault on democratic rights. And it's part of the deep rot in British society where, again, going back to Thatcher, Thatcher's great. One of our greatest successes was she's forced so many people, not just her, but like the policy she was part of and the movement she reflected, to internalize this idea that there is no alternative. And if there is no alternative, then why would you be disrupting people shopping on a Saturday over some genocide somewhere? It has nothing to do with us, and nothing's going to change.
Exactly. So real kind of disciplining effect.
Yeah, massively so. Yeah.
We have, because we've got about a minute left. We've got a question on YouTube from Grace. She's saying, how do we gain back our civil rights? Is there something that we can kind of do, or any information on the law changes or a movement working on bringing back civil liberties. And it's a good point, because I'm sure you don't think that there is no alternative, and that, you know, I'm sure you think it is a worthwhile fight to preserve and win back civil liberties that have been lost.
Yeah, not only worthwhile but essential. You know, like if we're going to achieve anything else, if we're going to start to address climate breakdown, if we're going to address the spiraling inequality and injustices in Britain, a whole range of other things, it's central. And again, the history of protest rights, and again, this goes back to like competing versions and so forth. But again, the real history of protest rights and civil liberties more broadly is that they were won through struggle. You know, they were won through people who were willing to organize together and coordinate actions, and if necessary, defy the existing laws. And so the people who are coming out and expressing support for Palestine action in opposition to the prescription that's happened there, that's one version of it, but we need a much bigger campaign. I'm part of an organization called Rise, and we've been trying to press trade unions to take more of a leading role in this, because if it's left to just those groups that are concerned with Palestine solidarity, or just those groups that are concerned with climate action, they'll be picked off and ground down one by one by the state. It has to be something that's done on a much bigger scale. And again, the reality of the history of the right to protest in Britain is that it was never granted. It was never ceded willingly by the ruling classes. It was forced from them. So there was a period where Gladstone in the 1870s, where he introduced a new law, or the 1890s, but he introduced a new law that basically it was something as simple as having to get permission from the police, having to notify the police in advance of a protest in a park in London. And this was such an aberration that the trade unions, the Irish Fenian organizations and others, for weeks on end, organized protests of tens of thousands of people without giving any notice. And the police and the government just gave up. They just went, okay, that's not going to work. And that, again, E.P. Thompson's done great work on this, but lots of other people as well, that this is how our rights were won in the first instance. And the real danger now, and this is taking it slightly sideways, but when the minimum requirements regulations were introduced, which was a massive attack on the rights of workers, the TUC, which is the leading representative body of workers in Britain, responded with a post on social media saying to the government, see you in court. Not see you on the streets, not see you at the picket lines that we will enforce with our members' democratic mandates, see you in the courts. And I say this as somebody who works as a lawyer, an academic lawyer for my day job. The courts aren't going to save us. The law isn't going to save us. There are strategic battles to be fought there, and the case around the prescription of Palestine action is valuable, and other cases are ongoing. But ultimately, it's only mass movements and mass organizations that come out and defend these rights that will ensure these rights going forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul O'Connell, for joining us to talk about both the long view and then, of course, the shorter view on the attack on civil liberties in the UK. So we have talked about our campaign. We've talked about the UK's relationship, deep historic relationship with Israel. And it takes a lot of work, the investigations that Declassified do. I'm going to say it again, if you can become a monthly supporter, I would be so, so grateful. We're going to bring on now Dania Akkad. She's our deputy editor. It is so great for you to be here this evening. And the first thing that I want to ask, as always, is do you have a deputy editor pick, a story that you want to highlight that the team have been working on?
Indeed, yeah, I do. And actually, I really appreciated that question from Grace we just had about how to fight, for our civil liberties. Because I'd say, one way we can do that is by being informed. And that leads into my pick of the week or the last couple of weeks. I think there's a piece on the website right now that is like a real gem that is really informative, and that anyone who's following, what's happening with our civil liberties and the Palestine action court cases and the prescription really should read this piece. Of course, it's by John McAvoy. And basically, it's about the sentencing coming up next Friday. So this is the 12th of June of the Filton 6. And I think, the Filton Six, probably most of our listeners will know who they are, but just in case anyone is out of the loop, they're the first group of activists who are being tried over the protest raid, their protest raid on the Israeli weapons factory in Bristol in 2024. And so at this hearing next Friday, and John mentioned this a little bit, but I want to get into it because I think it's really important. 4 of those activists could be sentenced as terrorists, even though they weren't convicted as for terrorism offenses. And this is unprecedented. This has never happened before. It's the first case where activists in this country risk prosecution under terrorism provisions. So John's latest piece, which ran last Thursday, and which I think we're going to have up on the screen somewhere, and you can find it on our homepage right now, it breaks down how we got to that point, and it is a real forensic look. There's a lot there, but it's all very important, and it kind of all needs to be there to understand how we got to where we are. I won't break it down for you here. You can get a glass of wine or a cup of tea or something and read it after this. But I just want to make 2 points about it. It raises 2 really important questions. One is how authorities in this country decide when protest-related criminal damages cross the line into terrorism.
Okay.
It's not clear. And I've heard John on the phone doing his interviews and working on this, and he's tried his best to get to the bottom of it, and it raises questions. There are a lot of questions still. And the second major question that it raises is whether there's a terrorism connection, whether a terrorism connection was added to these cases, these Filton cases, to justify the prescription of Palestine action. So there's a real chicken and egg question here that the piece raises. So I really hope people will read it and try to understand kind of how we got to here. And I just also wanted to say, it's a piece that blends together, FOIA requests, court reporting, interviews he's done, and just kind of his breadth of knowledge of all these different protest actions. So it really takes a lot to kind of put a piece like that together. And also just covering these cases in general has been quite complicated with all of the overlapping court restrictions and all the information you need to know. So I just, I wanted to sort of reflect on the difficulty of doing this reporting right now.
Yeah, because I suppose that piece is a kind of a showcase of all of the different skills that are used to have to get to a point where you can publish something like that. Is it quite an arduous process behind the scenes, Tanya? I know you love your job. I know you love it, but is it? I imagine it's a process, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I could hear John during the days up till we published this sort of like groaning in the corner, making this particular noise he always makes, which is like, when he's sort of like, when there's a lot going on.
Fresh.
Yeah, because there's so much information to kind of distill, and there's also restrictions on what we can report because of these live cases. So it's all a bit complicated, and it takes a lot of brain power to put it together.
Yeah, I can imagine. And as Dania said, it is really important that, we have this vast array of video production that we put out, but our website and the stories contained on there are so rich, aren't they? There's so much research that goes into an investigation like that can actually produce a public good eventually, even that can create impact. And it must be hours and hours of research for one story.
Yeah. I mean, and in John's case, I think Mark had said he was covering this for years, and I think that is truly the case. So much of what goes into his reporting, and particularly into this piece, is an accumulation of all of that. And there are unprecedented things that are happening in British legal history here. So, I mean, just on so many different levels, there's a lot we're dealing with. So, yeah.
You sometimes go to the court, don't you, Dania?
I do.
What's that experience like? So what are you trying to, because sometimes you might go to the court, but you're not allowed to report on what you've heard there. So is that about kind of soaking yourself up in the information to one day report? What's that about?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And so obviously you can tell from my accent, I'm American. I used to cover courts in the US. It's a
Okay.
completely different experience here. In the US, you can get a transcript online quickly. You can, it's really easy to kind of get what happened in court, a actual record of it. Here, you have to literally type out everything that's said because you cannot record in court, at least in the cases that I've been covering. So it's very tricky. And I've covered a couple of cases recently where there were restrictions. I couldn't report what I was sitting on. So I had to literally just go to these hours and they're really long hearings, 6 hours sitting there typing everything up and then just knowing I had to kind of sit with it until the restrictions were lifted. So it's a really odd experience, especially when in real time there are so many critical things happening and you can't say anything about what you've witnessed.
Very, very, I mean, very interesting / frustrating / very worthwhile. And that is exactly when we say your donations, and this is to everyone watching, when we say your donations fund our investigations, we are trying to get out articles, get out videos. We've produced, very recently a groundbreaking documentary. This is exactly what Dania just referenced, is exactly the kind of thing that your monthly donations fund, the ability for people to go and sit and listen and soak up and get the quality of the detail, and then hours and hours of research to break really important things that the public ought to know as a matter of course, but of course the system won't let us know as a matter of course. So this kind of journalism is crucial. Thank you to everybody for watching tonight. Please go and read the piece that Dania referenced. And thank you so much to all of our contributors as well. Good evening.